Cassius Clay is an MPhil student at the University of Cambridge, having completed 1 year with the Department of Modern European History and currently finishing a second year with the History of Art department. He majored in art history at Yale as an undergraduate and received the Paul Mellon Fellowship to pursue these graduate studies at Cambridge. Clay's recent research has analyzed diplomatic tensions between the United Kingdom and the United States over the strategic control of industrial diamonds during World War II, and his current studies focus on the intersection of art, fashion, and advertising during the interwar period. He is in the process of completing his dissertation on the British painter Meredith Frampton, a Royal academician active between 1918 and 1945. Clay has interned at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, as well as at Christie's and the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. He has also worked as a creative consultant for Kanye West and as a student guide at the Yale Center for British Art. And I think it's pretty safe to say that these two jobs have never been used in the same sentence before. Welcome, Cassius.
And this is the movie thing, right? Thank you, Sophie, for that introduction. I'm very happy to be back here, especially to have heard from Imogen Hart yesterday, who was the first art history class I ever took at Yale, and also to be invited back by Tim Berenger, who was my supervisor and knows firsthand how late my drafts are. And thank you to all of you for coming this morning and listening to this set of conference papers. My paper considers the political mobilization of pictures and pictorial organization of facts. It's about war art, heartening words, and strategic deployment of information as both a means of propaganda and an artistic end in its own right. I'll be focusing this morning on Meredith Frampton's 1943 group portrait of Sir Ernest Gowers and members of his staff at the headquarters of the London Regional Civil Defence Control Room. I choose it because the painting neatly distills the abstract chaos of war into the concrete banalities of civil defense and the schematic organization of civic order. It is both a glowing endorsement of the bureaucratic procedure of British civil servants and a chilling picture of their sang-froid when framed within the historical context of horrifying casualties and dark uncertainty in the droning months of the London Blitz. The title of my paper borrows its terms from Plain Words, a perennial style guide that Sir Ernest Gowers, our principal sitter, would publish soon after the war was won, and War Paint, a book published for the Paul Mellon Center by Brian Foss in 2007. Foss's book, War Paint, offers a valuable survey of the activities of the War Artists Advisory Committee, which we've heard a bit about and will abbreviate as the WAAC. It was an organization headed by Sir Kenneth Clarke during the Second World War to promote the arts of Britain, produce compelling visual records of the conflict, and to protect a generation of artists from repeating the cultural annihilation of the First World War. Now, rather than take issue with the book's broader arguments or take for granted the masterful research that it compiles, one objective of this paper is to take a closer look at Foss's major contention that the War Artist Advisory Committee's patronage contributes to a, quote, critical evaluation of 20th century British art as a whole, by foregrounding, quote, questions of art and self-image, art patronage, and links between art and society during the Second World War. In general, this is a fine conceptual framework that enables Foss to make satisfying, if totalizing, statements like this one. He writes, the WAAC laid the basis for a nationally shared, popular, and contemporary culture that not only bespoke what was touted as a genuinely British sensibility, but also that stressed the absolute relevance of art by making it respond directly to the most cataclysmic event most of the population would ever know. But in certain episodes of this analysis, and Foss's inadequate treatment of Frampton in particular, the book makes value claims about what constituted the most successful war art, in order to justify the conclusion to its arguments, namely how the WAAC, quote, affected the trajectory of British modernism in the post-war period. For example, Foss gives Frampton's decidedly academic painting short shrift. Foss writes, quote, "Painstakingly calculated images such as these, admirable though they were as works of art, fell short of conveying the speed, violence, and unpredictability of the aerial war itself," referring to the London Blitz. This critique misses its target, lobbed without much calibration, and guided by a short-sighted view of what the Blitz meant to Britain and how the WAAC wanted art to reflect it. It is difficult to imagine, as Foss has done, that Frampton ever intended to convey speed, violence, or unpredictability, or that these objectives were ever put to him by the WAAC, which commissioned this picture. Even John Hinn's photographic records of civil defense activity, like this scene of an auxiliary firefighting team hauling water pumps from a modified taxicab, represent the busy work of clearing rubble and dousing fires with diagrammatic clarity and task-minded focus. Thus, I will argue that patience, calm, and rational thought were in fact the primary civic imperatives coordinated by the men and women of the London Regional Civil Defence Control Room, and that these imperatives informed Frampton's artistic impulses towards the hyper-realistic style through which he describes them in paint. That is to say, Frampton produced an internally coherent painting whose immaculate facture not only mirrors the orderly scene that it represents, but actually reflects the same principles of disciplined resolve that were demanded of the British people and that sustained the British nation throughout the war. Frampton's painting, set in a bunker beneath the Natural History Museum in Kensington, registers the London Regional Civil Defence Control Room as a critical nerve centre of the British home front in stoic but unheroic terms, echoing Sir Ernest Gowers' own plain words, "We withstood." To fully understand what Gowers meant by this and how Frampton conveyed its sense in paint, some context is required. I'll situate the Gowers portrait within the body of Frampton's oeuvre by examining the circumstances of its commission by the WAAC. I will then go on to discuss some of the important work done by Gowers as Senior Regional Commissioner for London that recommended the distinction of his portrait being painted. And by looking at other contemporaneous war art and photographic records, I will attempt to show how Frampton's painting was in its scope, how unusual Frampton's painting was in its scope, as well as how usefully its treatment condenses the significant forms of resilience into, as we can see, memos, maps, and milk. Born in 1894 to the sculptor Sir George Frampton and Lady Christabel Frampton, Meredith Frampton inherited an artistic tradition from both parents, attended Royal Academy schools in London, became an Associate Royal Academician in 1934, and a full Royal Academician in 1942, at which point he was working on the Gowers portrait we're looking at today. Between the end of the First and the start of the Second World War, Frampton exhibited at least one painting at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition every year but 1933. These paintings were often commissions of intellectual figures in Britain, framed like modern-day saints by their professional attributes. Though some of the portraits of women are perhaps better known to us now, as they weren't commissions and entered public collections more readily. Rather suddenly, the artist stopped exhibiting after 1945, resigned from the Royal Academy in 1953, and lived in near total seclusion in Wiltshire with his wife Hilda until 1984. Meredith Frampton was indeed a man, though expectations of nomenclature could absolve you for thinking otherwise. Isabella Rossellini did too, when she hawked her eponymous handbag for Bulgari in this Frampton-inspired campaign photographed by Annie Leibovitz. I bring up this frivolous instance of confusion to demonstrate the ironies that result from an unstudied approach to Frampton's work and its ersatz afterlife in commercial fashion advertisements. But I think they also point to a much more serious issues that turn on questions of residual poor scholarship and the perpetuation of inaccurate information. Because of his limited output, abrupt retirement, and a highly academic style at odds with the 20th century's turn towards abstraction, literature on Frampton has always been scant and recently stagnant. Richard Morfitt's catalogue introduction to a 1982 Tate exhibition constitutes the most complete and current essay on the artist. It is 12 pages long. I returned to Frampton's portrait of Gowers and his staff in order to demonstrate how small errors in art criticism can metastasize into fundamental misreadings of history. Brian Foss, writing in war paint, mixes up the identities of Gowers' assisting staff. The middle figure was named as A.J. Child when he is in fact K.A.L. Parker, with Child to the right in the beige. And the rightmost sitter in the beige was titled the Senior Regional Commissioner, when that is, of course, Gowers' position. Foss locates the setting as the ARP control room when correspondence from Parker states that, quote, there was no such thing as an ARP control room at regional level. In fact, the description ARP had gone out of use before the date of the picture, and anyway was never used about regional HQ. ARP stood for Air Raid Precautions, which was an organization folded into Civil Defense Service in 1941, 2 years before the painting was finished. These mistakes are bad practice, but they also constitute a dangerous distortion of reality when marshaled in service of sweeping art historical pronouncements, like Foss's exaltation of Paul Nash's Battle of Britain. Foss's analysis is gratuitously made at the expense of Frampton, using the verisimilitude of the Gowers portrait as a foil. Foss writes of Nash's painting, quote, this was exactly the creative approach to documentation that transcended Meredith Frampton's obsession with optical detail. I will not engage Foss's notion of transcendence here, but I will point out that such a creative approach to documentation, like the one Foss deployed in his misidentification of Frampton's sitters, their titles, and their setting, would have had little traction in the documentary and evidential world of the London Regional Civil Defence Control Room. Both in the initial conception of Meredith Frampton's commission and the eventual construction of the Gowers portrait, approaches to documentation were precise, economical, and considered. The War Artists Advisory Committee first discussed Frampton's engagement for 2 portrait commissions at the beginning of December 1941. One sitter was to be nominated by the Ministry of Home Security. This subject was Sir Ernest Gowers, and a second was to be nominated by the Admiralty. That commission never came to be, as the war concluded before a suitable subject could be found. The WAAC contract would offer Frampton a standard fee of 50 guineas for a head and shoulders portrait or 75 guineas for a half-length rendering, but included the unusual provision of, quote, additional payment on delivery of a picture which has clearly entailed an unusual amount of work on the part of the artist. Upon receiving the remarkable picture of the Gowers portrait, the WAAC decided to double the price paid to 150 guineas. Frampton's initial response on the right indicates a commitment to patriotic service, which he foresaw as possibly impeding the commission proposed. He wrote that it, quote, it would give me great pleasure to accept your kind suggestion that I should paint 2 portraits, but as my age is 47, it seems probable that I shall be called up almost immediately. In the absence of any definite ruling on this point, I think it would be unwise to start work which could not be finished. Frampton, who had already served in France during the First World War, drawing aerial schematics for trench maps after bombs would change those lines, was referring to the National Service, the No. 2 Act, which was passed a few weeks later on December 18, 1941. That act extended the age of national service to 60, including military service for up to age 51, and that would cover Frampton at age 47. Records at the Ministry of Information indicate some back and forth in terms of how explicitly they could tell Frampton that he would be excused from a call to service. Quote, am I correct in thinking it would be in order for me to tell him in writing that we can have his calling up deferred pending his completion of the commission of painting portraits for us? Asked one official. Ultimately, it was decided that the ministry would ask for his call-up to be deferred, but without a guarantee, and that call-up never happened. But with that settled, Frampton began work early in the new year, in 1942. But by the spring of 1942, he had run out of materials needed and needed to write to the Ministry of Information again in order to obtain official certification that would allow the art supplier Winsor & Newton to release art materials for the Gowers portrait. These communications allow us to glimpse the degree to which resource control impacted daily life in Britain, even in an established artist's pursuit of pigments and brushes. Winsor & Newton had to certify the stocks supplied to Frampton and then receive official permission to replenish those stocks because of their use for official purposes, complicated by the fact that the present difficulty with regards to tubes, which were made of aluminum in demand for myriad other uses in the war, entailed another entanglement of permits from alternative suppliers. Frampton's official correspondence with the Ministry of Information also gives us insight into his conscientious character. In the summer of 1942, Frampton wrote to the ministry that since certifying the paints and the numbers he required, he, quote, "It has occurred to me that they are only an estimate of what will be required for the work. I think it a reasonably accurate forecast, but of course there is the possibility I shall not use it all. If you would prefer me to wait until the work is finished and then furnish you with a definite amount of the materials used, perhaps you would very kindly post back to me here." This earned the bemused response to the effect of "Don't worry about it" from the ministry. Frampton wrote asking again for an appointment to submit the painting as it was finished for censorship in the spring of 1943 and received a similarly permissive response, that it would be, quote, "quite impossible for a censor to visit the studio," and that, quote, "it may be that a description of the portrait and its title will suffice." I suspect it was due to this instruction that Frampton gave the painting the descriptive, specific, and unwieldy title that we grapple with today. It also seems likely that Frampton deliberately obscured the text on pages in the Gowers portrait in order to maintain the principles of censorship, as can be seen from Frampton's 1938 painting of Sir Frederick Hopkins on the right. It was well within Frampton's ability to write out minuscule text in paint. The Hopkins portrait spells out lepidopterin, which is the pigment in butterfly wings, and below it the related formula for wavelengths of light absorption when it hits those pigments. Still, it is remarkable that the detail of blurred text in Gower's hand shows it to be typed rather than handwritten. But it was Gowers himself who dictated the unusual addition of two staff members, Kenneth Parker and Lieutenant Colonel Child, from left to right. Frampton had only painted one other group portrait of two sisters 2 decades earlier in 1923, and the Gowers portrait was the largest canvas he ever produced. Kenneth Parker, who served Gowers as Deputy Administrative Officer, described how Gowers thought it would look, quote, it would look rather absurd for him to appear as if he operated the control room on his own, and Frampton quite rightly wanted him to be painted against a significant background. So he suggested to Child and me that as fairly representative figures, we might be posed as what might be described as supporting players, and of course, we were happy to agree. It's really pretty symbolic, like Louis XIV crossing the Rhine. I argue that the symbolic arrangement described by Parker is radically different from the historical antecedent of war art that he cites, and crucially distinct from the nearly contemporaneous war art of Hitler's Germany, which clad the Führer in armor and a hateful standard. It seems likely that Gowers, who had worked in propaganda at Wellington House in World War I, knew exactly what messages this portrait ought to convey. Frampton would later write, quote, "I like the person to tell me exactly what he wants done. Nowadays, the artist is supposed to be, miles above everybody else, and what he says goes. But I don't like that." In the Spartan control room of London Regional Civil Defence, Gowers and his staff wear plain civilian clothes. They each hold pencils and papers, and Frampton paints them in the midst of compiling daily reports on bombings in London, as well as fortnightly reports on the city's levels of homelessness, food, water, and general morale. Gowers and his staff would have been in the midst of producing documents like this one, a manual for the disposal of unexploded bombs, This tactical procedure is signified by Frampton in a small detail on the lower left side of the portrait, which shows a tally of roadblocks, unexploded high-explosive bombs, unexploded parachute machines, and fires. The detail deliberately addresses a menace known vividly to the besieged population of London with deft subtlety. The map of London, shown over Gower's shoulder, situates these types of incidents geographically, which enabled them to be tabulated into assessing the areas hardest hit. The district boundaries give a macroscopic view of the micromanagement required to coordinate the 101 authorities within the London region. This hierarchy of command also extended laterally to reconcile military and civil defense interests. For example, a military plan to drain St. James Park in central London just by Buckingham Palace and deploy tank obstacles to impede a potential Axis invasion was probably rightly abandoned because it would have jeopardized the London region's ability to fight fires with water pumped from that lake. Other war artists gravitated to these types of maps for the formal qualities of their color blocking and abstract mass. They rendered the same plans quite differently as spectral sprawls in these paintings by Eric Revilius, watercolors, or as dehumanized figurations and numerical patterns in the more abstract work of John Piper. But these data sets represented real human experiences and the visual methods of allocating resources to protect them. Today, they remain visceral evidence of redeemed calamity, as seen in the superimposition of bomb coordinates that were recorded by Gower's staff on today's maps of West London and East London. Frampton skillfully achieves this connection between objective material observation and the material objectives of lives and homes at stake. For all the horrors of combat in battle, the home front was equally punishing. Richard Titmuss has observed that the number of civilians killed by war operations in Britain outnumbered those of the armed forces until 2 years after the war began. It was not until 3 years after the outbreak of fighting that the number of British soldiers killed exceeded that of British women and children. In London County, only 1 house in 10 was undamaged. In the London district of Bermondsey, only 4 houses in 100 were unaffected by the bombing. The detachment of terms like disposition of reserves, which you can maybe read vaguely in the kind of blue bands of the table at the right side of the painting, denotes the number of ambulances in each color-coordinated region. These were actually affixed by personal engagement and discrete moves of leadership. For instance, Gowers was responsible for amalgamating local fire brigades throughout the region into a national fire service that could be centrally dispatched according to the asymmetrical bombing of London's districts. On nights of heavy bombing, there could be as many as 1,800 discrete fires requiring emergency attention. It would be difficult to overemphasize Gower's responsibilities, both actively assumed and held in reserve. Gowers oversaw London's air raid wardens, blackout arrangements, firefighting services, first aid, rescue, and bomb squads. In the wake of bombing, he was responsible for provisioning evacuated and homeless Londoners with shelter. Throughout, he organized citizens' labor contributions to the city's civil defense. He was also given provisional autonomy to lead the London area in case of invasion and the failure of central government. His letter of appointment from Churchill read, quote, "If communication with the government becomes very difficult or impossible, it may be necessary for you to act on behalf of the government. You will be entitled to expect all persons to give you facilities or assistance in pursuance of their duty to cooperate in the defense of the realm." The centralized responsibilities borne by Gowers and his staff depended on the integrity of infrastructure and a commitment to preserving systems of regular life on the ground that could resist bombardment from above. Frampton includes 3 telephones, their lines being part of a precautionary redundancy to ensure that if bombing severed one connection, communications could be rerouted through another. The artist also includes a conspicuous cup and saucer, as well as a fresh bottle of milk. A critic writing for the Studio in 1943, after the painting's exhibition at the Royal Academy, took note of this and complained that, quote, any semi-heroic portrait should have an adequate objective climax. And in this case, the senior regional commissioner seems to be depicted in labor to produce a very realistic milk bottle. This viewpoint ignores the Herculean efforts required in maintaining the continuity of something as simple as milk deliveries to a capital under siege, which required roads to be repaired, railroads to function, a division of manpower to produce a staple nutrition in wartime, and rationing to prevent shortages. This much was known to Frampton at the time of the portrait's creation. In a letter to Gowers' wife, Frampton wrote that, from the first moment I saw Sir Ernest, I had little doubt about the final result, but I should like you to know how much I valued his unfailing patience and sympathetic outlook during the long process of building up the picture. You can understand that the atmosphere so created is in itself inspiring. Constants within chaos are powerful things. Memos, maps, and milk are simple staples of stability. But Frampton's painting of Gowers and his staff reminds us more broadly that official portraiture can operate in complex and unexpected ways. This portrait of civil defense officials in a bunkered headquarters explicitly emphasizes the importance of their systematic work to keep London running. But it implicitly makes a guarantee of resilience to a public that should be confident in their nation's perseverance. It also anticipates a future in which that duty has been fulfilled. It anticipates the retrospection of our world, one made possible by our data schematics, command structures, and sacrifice. Thank you for accomplishing that attention by considering this painting with me today.